And good afternoon, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. It's great to be here. We're joined by Deborah DeGroff, who is the host of a very important website, What's Inside Children's Books. And Deborah has done a lot of research on sort of the inside story of children's publishing and what may be there and what is there that's not necessarily visible to average people, and that it essentially amounts to subversion. Deborah, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. So, Deborah, I think that this is something that I was not all that aware of. I mean, I'm certainly aware of how the left has subverted much of our society and their entire agenda, but children's books, we're talking like nursery school, kindergarten books, that this stuff has all these messages in it. Let's set the table, as they say in talk radio, and give me an overview of what's going on here.
Well, the reason I do this, I started doing this over 30 years ago. And I learned real early that parents assume that books are neutral. They think that they are safe. They have no idea there might even be profanity in a children's books. So there for a long time, people thought, well, maybe it's just in the young adult books. Or if I talk about one book, they'll ask their child, have you read that book? No, I haven't read the book. So they just breathe a sigh of relief and go on with their life. And so I always like to ask, well, how many would it take to show you that it's an issue? 5, 10, 100, 1,000? And I'm not anybody's guru. I don't intend to be. What I try to do is to establish to parents what is inside children's books so that you can take a look at this issue and know what to look for by yourself. Right. And it doesn't start with high school children. It starts with the preschoolers.
So let's go over a couple of examples of where various liberal left ideology has been slipped into the books. And as you say, profanity and violence and sexual images and all the rest.
Okay, well, we don't expect issues to come into preschool books. I think most of us, if we could look back to when we raised our 3-year-old, we think about the silly or nice or kindness messages or something like that we had in those preschool books. Now it is activism. We're telling 3-year-olds to resist. What are they going to resist? They're 3. Mm-hmm. Okay, how are they going to assemble? How are they going to give money? How are they going to file a lawsuit? And one book that I did a whole article about on my website is Brave Girl, about Clara Lemlich. And Clara, I think people think these are just made up books because they're for children. But she was a real life person. She was a communist. Her son is mentioned in the Venona papers. And for those of you who know history, this is where we were intercepting the intelligence between decrypting it between the Soviet Union and the United States during World War II.
Right. Let me just interject here. In other words, her son was helping Stalin during World War II and after,
yes.
and passing secrets from the U.S. government to Stalin to help him. So we're talking about, a real, hardcore Stalinist here that, was involved with espionage, sabotage, whatever, intelligence gathering. A spy, basically.
Yeah, well, the point, Clara, in 1909, she wasn't even a card-carrying communist, okay? Right. She was already a revolutionary and a radical. But the question is, why would this be a book for 4-year-olds? You've got to think about that first. Mm-hmm. And you think about everything that was omitted, and they tried to depict her. This is where, as an adult, if you go back and you can watch that book, and I have the link on my website. You can listen to the whole book and see the pictures. Okay, why are they depicting her as a child? See, we're trying to create activists, and all through the book, I established that. They're depicting her as a young girl. And see, she's leading this strike. and the police beat her and break 6 of her ribs. Do you want to read that to your 4-year-old before they go to bed?
No, not to mention that it obviously is, what they're doing when they plant these kinds of seeds at a very, very young age, when someone is just beginning to form their mind, their intellect, they're still
Right.
innocent, is
Yes.
that they are planting seeds that then might start to blossom later, when in the future they start hearing agitation, for example,
Mhm.
against police or against, like pro-communist type agitation, and it triggers. It's like, oh, okay, I know that I'm part of this. They may not even remember the actual book or where the language came from, but you're basically implanting pieces of propaganda into the minds and into the souls, actually, of very young people. And they don't really know it. They don't understand the context. Parents are too busy to
Right.
pay attention to it. Some of the parents at this point were themselves indoctrinated when they were little
Yes.
children, so they think, oh, this is as wholesome and as great as motherhood and apple pie. They don't really think about, what's being conveyed here. They actually like it. Now, something else that you get into, Deborah, on your website is one of these issues that I sort of was aware of on the edges, and I kind of figured it was going to become a thing, but it seems so unreal to me and unbelievable that I didn't even pay much attention to it until now. And that is this phenomena of drag queen child, storytelling time. I mean, I thought this was some kind of a freak thing that would happen. They would come in like a little kamikaze mission, like they used to do with sex education. All of a sudden, without telling parents, somebody would be in there doing a presentation and then they'd be out before you knew it. So I kind of knew it was coming down the pike, but this is the kind of thing that very predictably is going mainstream. Now, how in the world do they justify that? I mean, what are they saying? You have videos there where you see people who are, quite frankly, pretty gross, and who are
Mhm.
there with preschool, with kindergarten, first grade children, and they're basically showing sort of not quite sexual images, but stuff that kind of gets a little closer than we might want to see for children. And they themselves are, just, they have a persona that's not exactly, the right one for children. How are they getting away with that? I mean, who is, allowing that?
Well, number one, you have the American Library Association. One article I have actually says that they're training them on how to read to these children during the story time. Now, I don't know whether if you as a father or grandfathers out there, I don't know if you have to be trained if you volunteer, but they are being trained and they're reading very expressively. But you have
I've
to
noticed
ask
this.
yourself, what are they reading? And the parents, I think it's one of those things that they just feel like it's in vogue for them to take their children to something like this. And, I'm cool and I'm enlightened if I take my children to these drag queen story hours, and you're a prude and some kind of hater if you don't. The last article I did on that on my website, the drag queen Little Miss Hot Mess that wrote the book that you're probably referring to, um, he quoted in there that his friend Michelle T was the one that had invited him to be a storytime reader. And she is the one who founded this.
hmm
Now, I deal with children's books, not adult books, but I pulled the adult book that he referred to that Michelle T wrote. And I want to tell you something, you will not get very far before you close it. It is, and you look at somebody that has that kind of perceptions and that could write the things that are in that book. And you want to tell me that the drag queen story hour is something you should be taking your 3-year-olds, and these are the people that you should be exposing them to?
What is their rationale for this? I mean, it doesn't, do we need this to teach young children how to read? I mean, I think that my dear friend, the late great Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld, had a
Yes,
great program to teach young people how
yes,
to
he
read
did.
phonics. English is a phonetic language.
Yes,
Let's learn how to sound out the vowels and consonants so they can then read on their own and think on their own. Are these people? I mean, from just strictly a pedagogical standpoint, are they contributing anything toward the ability of a young person to learn how to read?
No, no. And if you'd let me make a little leap there, I have an article on the site about struggling readers, and I have a chapter in my book on reluctant readers. And with these, they talk about enticing children to read. So, for example, if I was a teacher and you're in my 10th grade English class and you have never learned how to read properly, I mean, you were never taught like Sam taught, okay?
Yes.
All right. So let's just say you're a very poor reader. Then what they do, instead of supplying materials or a teacher that would teach you in the proper way so that now you can read anything, they've created books that are on a first or second grade reading level for those children to make sure that they're indoctrinated also. Okay? For example, Saddleback Educational Publishing, they have a division called Gravel Road. And in those Gravel Road books, so far there's at least 22 of them, and I've reviewed several of those. You're dealing with transgenders, you're dealing with bisexuals, everything in between, but they're written below a second grade reading level.
So are these being marketed to first graders, so to kindergarten?
Not the ones I just told you about. They're
Okay.
marketed for you as a 9th to 12th grader.
Well, yeah, that's because our young people, with all, and I know this sounds a little intense to say this, but they're semi-illiterate when they graduate high school.
Yes,
You know,
you're absolutely right.
because they have not been taught phonetically how to read and then how to think properly. I mean, this is an agenda. Sam Blumenfeld wrote many books on the topic. He's a dear friend, the late Dr. Sam
Yes.
Blumenfeld, and we did a lot of programming on this. That the agenda goes back to the turn of the century, really, and John Dewey and some of these so-called progressive educators. They wanted to turn the education into something that would create a collective person. They did not want young people to think on their own and become self-actualized and in control of their own destiny, whether that be becoming like an artist or a CEO or a surf bum or whatever it is. They would have the right to think properly, think cognitively, and read properly, which is through phonics. English is a phonetic language after all. And instead they would have this kind of look-say thing where they would have to memorize words as if they were little hieroglyphics. You'd have to like look at words like they were pictures. And the result has been, and this is according to a lot of people who have studied this, including this Harvard professor, I forget her name off the top of my head, but she wrote a book on it in the 60s, that it's created things like ADD and dyslexia and it's short-circuited the brain. You have people, Sam did an article where there was research done on prisons inmates, and they found that about 80% of them are functional illiterates. They did not learn how to read. That's the first building block toward becoming a responsible, in control, sovereign citizen of the United States. And so they short circuit that at an early age because Dewey wanted to collectivize students. He wanted them to, he took away the student looking at the teacher and the teacher, instructing. Instead, they started circles where the teacher would become like a psychologist. They would facilitate rather than teach. And the result is that you have behaviorism. So that's the beginning of the entry into this collectivization. Now we're talking about removing the basic moral code that upon which Western civilization rests. They're trying to subvert that through these images and through this lesson. The big one right now, as you say, that's trendy is to blur the gender differences, the sex differences between men and women, to say there is no such thing. This is a social construct. It's not real. And that therefore you can be whatever you want. And that's anyone who disagrees with that is a bigot, is a prejudice.
Well, you're absolutely right. And Sam Blumenfeld is a hero of mine also.
Yeah,
so, I started out my book actually talking about the very things that you just mentioned. Now, he wrote The New Illiterates,
Yes.
basically, and how to keep your children from being one. And there he tore apart the Dick and Jane readers.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. On mine, I went back to my first grade readers because I happened to have the teacher's manual. And it actually says in there, we do not teach the sounds of vowels because they're too unreliable. Okay.
That's insane.
So they do not introduce it till sometime in second grade after they have mastered the word attack. So I lay those foundations. I have probably 300 readers that I collect from the 1800s up to 1965, where you can see this quite clearly. And the ones that are word guessing, of course, have the word lists at the back of the book. The gin readers from the 40s introduced the word airplane as one of the first 21 words, but up wasn't introduced until the third reader. Okay. And
well, first of all, the whole idea is horrendous.
Insane.
That they're going to memorize words,
Yes.
like as if English was Chinese. And it's okay if Chinese uses hieroglyphics, so doesn't Japanese, and that's fine. But that's not what English is. That's not what the Romance or the Germanic or the Slavic languages do. We have an alphabet that goes back to the ancient Phoenicians. That's where the word, phonics comes from, where you have vowels and consonants and you sound them out. There's no mystery to this. That is, right. It's just like a dentist has to learn how to drill for cavities. A reader has to learn phonics. It's the basic tools that you use. So now that it started to accelerate in the 60s, and that coincided with the alternative culture, the counterculture generation. But now they are deliberately, consciously, and literally going on top of that by introducing these, what I would call immoral images. I don't want to get too explicit here because this is YouTube and I'll be censored. So we have to be careful because those are the people that run this station, frankly. Right. But let's just say that it's moral relativism. It's not conventional Judeo-Christian understanding of right and wrong. Now, their explanation, and again, I'm not playing devil's advocate here, but I'm simply noting that they'll say, well, to not do this would be to subject people who are in minorities, particularly in the area of sexuality, to abuse, to possible murder, to physical harm. That somehow they have to do this, and they have to introduce these ideas as normal, so that they can feel approved, and that the people who would otherwise harm them won't do that because it'll be accepted in society. How do you argue that? I've heard this argument made by people that I know and respect.
Well, that's gone back a long, long time. Okay, that I remember a professor telling me that they had to have books all with dysfunctional families. Okay, this was about 30 years ago, because a child couldn't relate that grew up in a dysfunctional family unless you had books about dysfunctional families. And I suggested, wouldn't it be more healthy for them to have established good role models so that they could aspire to something like that? Now, I don't know about you, but you don't go around teaching your children, any children, regardless of your viewpoint. It's not the good thing to teach them to hate anybody or to go out and to kill or this or that. But I can tell you this, there's a lot of literature, even from the LGBT side, showing that there is great violence between homosexual people. Okay,
right,
and they're making it that we hate them so much that we're putting their lives in jeopardy. And this branches out to the authentic voices. I had to do a whole chapter on this. Now they will sit there and say, well, Charles Moscowitz cannot write a book about a transgender protagonist because he is not a transgender. Okay,
right.
So now my book, if I was a transgender, then mine might get published. But the next thing might be, if I'm a transgender with one leg and you're a transgender with two legs, then mine's going to trump yours. You know, it just
Oh,
never
that whole
ends.
argument
It
is
never ends. Yes,
completely unintellectual. It would be like
yes.
saying that a male novelist can't write about a female character, or vice
All right.
versa. You know,
Think
it's
about
sort of
Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens
right.
in the old curiosity shop, Little Nell, people lined the wharf of New York when the ship came in so they could get the paper to find out whether Little Nell lived or died. Charles Dickens was not a 14-year-old girl, yet you had the world awaiting because they identified with Little Nell.
Of
That's the
course,
qualities of a good author,
that's
not
right.
because of an authentic voice.
No, it's the creative process that you put
Yes,
yourself. Someone
yes.
who is a creator can put themselves in the shoes of someone
Hmm.
that they have nothing to do with. That's not like them. I
Right.
mean, this whole idea is absurd. That
Yes.
you'd have to be that person in order to write about them. I mean, it's and they've used that to shut down arguments. Now,
Right.
let's go to their side of the argument for the sake of argument, and
Okay.
say,
Hmm.
let's say they do want to write about a dysfunctional family. Why not write about a dysfunctional family that has overcome problems, that has,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
rather than, this kind of naturalistic view that there's something good about being dysfunctional. Instead, you
Hmm.
talk about the existence of this phenomena because it's true, it happens, and then
Yes.
you talk about how they compensate and how they cope and how they deal with it.
Okay. I agree. There are authors that I would not recommend their books, but
Hmm.
they deal with issues.
Right.
Um, and some of these issues we need to talk about.
Okay. Do you have a question for my guest, Mark? Are you there? Okay, we have a. There we
Okay.
go. Yep. Okay, go ahead.